Cinda Rushton and I had the pleasure of hearing Mary Ellen speak at a palliative care conference in Montreal back in the fall, and we thought she would be a fantastic participant for this seminar series. Dr. MacDonald is a medical anthropologist in the Division of Oral Health and Society. She can explain that affiliation at McGill University. Her research program focuses on two vulnerable populations with urgent health needs. One vulnerable population being the Aboriginal population, and the other is palliative care patients and their families. So seemingly sort of disparate, but I certainly understand in my own career what it's like to have what seem like different disparate content areas and a real unifying theme. Her research, particular in palliative care, has included postdoctoral training in pediatric palliative care at the Montreal Children's Hospital, a socio-cultural analysis of child death, and adult palliative care projects, including in the Aboriginal populations. She is also an associate member of the McGill School of Nursing, Departments of Oncology and Pediatrics, and core faculty at the Center for Medical Education. And she's an affiliate member of the McGill Biomedical Ethics Unit and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Victoria. So you see her topic on this slide. And what we'll do is have Mary Ellen speak till about 1 o'clock, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion and questions. So please join me in welcoming Mary Ellen MacDonald.
Can everyone hear me okay? Can you still hear me if I do this? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Okay. So thank you so much, Gail, for your lovely and kind introduction. I feel like I need to start with a bit of a mea culpa because we had a few complications this weekend. I'm so glad to be here. It is such an honor to be here, especially for this lectureship. Just a quick little story, a little lesson for everybody. When you're traveling, make sure your documents are up to date. We booked the trip, everything was fine, my documents weren't up to date. I started the process to get them up to date so that I could actually get on the plane. And then what happens, but we have the Boston Marathon bombings, and it seemed like my passport went into limbo. The Department of Limbo took up my passport, and it was just gone. And so the moral of the story is make sure everything is up to date. Don't assume anything. And from here on in my family, this event is referred to as the Baltimoral of the story. So in this talk, I'm going to be presenting my ongoing research that I believe is really important to deepen our understanding of what I'm calling the socio-moral worlds of bereaved parenting. And this is a phrase that I hope will become clearer as I go through the talk. So my engagement with bioethics has really been using empirical social science to kind of trouble through, kind of as opportunities to think about ethical issues and hoping to advance our practice and our policies based upon these empirical findings. And perhaps even in the discussion period, we might be able to return to that conversation about empirical research for normative policy change. If I can work this. So my lecture is really built around this study. This is a study that was funded nationally in Canada. I want to acknowledge my interdisciplinary team here. In this study, we really tried to draw on popular culture, we tried to draw on public policy, and also what's going on in the internet as three locations where we can think about bereaved parenting. And in this talk, I'm going to take us through kind of a guided journey through this project and look at some of the kind of taken for granted assumptions that we have in our culture about bereaved parents and try to do that to kind of uncover some of the values that we have about and at this population. So, as you're probably aware, anthropologists kind of like to pick at taboos. We like to unpack taboos and think about taboos. And death is one of those taboo topics. And I think it really sits at a kind of a place of ambivalence in our culture. It is kind of everywhere but nowhere. So it's everywhere. It's in entertainment. It's in the news. Unfortunately, too much in the news, but it's in the news. But it also is really what we do in the evenings. We turn on CSI, we turn on the TV, and we watch these kind of shows. They're always about death. And yet, at the same time, it's kind of nowhere. It's still very cloistered. It's medicalized. It's behind these institutions. It's in palliative care or hospice type institutions. It's very hyper-individualized in our society. It kind of, scholars will tell us that it used to be, and I don't want to romanticize it, but it kind of used to be kind of ritualized and tamed within a social order. It happened to social communities, whereas now death happens to individuals. We locate it in the individual. And part of this is kind of the medicalization process of death. And I think palliative care has tried to respond to this a little bit. Palliative medicine and palliative care are still biomedical disciplines. They've tried to respond a little bit to resist the medicalization of death with things like whole person care and mindfulness. But at the same time, we still need to find death within the body. But death doesn't happen to people. It's located within the body because of decomposing bodies or pathologies that happen within bodies. And that, I just need to underscore, is a very modern way to think about death. So then what about grief? Well, most of our death research is actually about life. It's about end of life, or it's about the people who are living after someone has died. That's kind of the location of death research. And so hand in hand with this kind of medicalizing of death, we see the parallel medicalizing of grief. And so where once we might have had kind of ritual and social practices to kind of help repair or restore what had happened to kind of a disrupted social order, now we have professionals who work to restore and repair what happens to a disrupted individual. So the counseling professions are focused on the individual, not the overarching social order. And it is through this kind of medicalizing gaze that we can then think about grief in terms of prolonged grief, or pathological grief, or disenfranchised grief, or complicated grief. These are the words that we use to talk about grief. Again, very medicalized and located within an individual. And one of the repercussions of this sort of gaze is now the bereaved are seen as inherently at risk for mental disorders, for depression, for PTSD, or for anxiety disorders. And we saw that kind of come to popular press when the draft of the DSM-5 was released, and we saw the bereavement exclusion criteria, the whole conversation around that, and the major depressive disorders. So the whole idea was, if you were still depressed 2 weeks after you had experienced a loss, were you or were you not possibly meeting a criteria for depression? And so the palliative care community kind of came out and said, no, 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 grief is a natural part of life. It should not be pathologized. Whereas a lot of the proponents of this new draft said, no, 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 it's really important to protect the vulnerable with these diagnostic labels in order to then intervene. So it was an interesting conversation, but it was quite a heated conversation. So this is a lecture, though, about child death and about parental grief. So I will argue that child death and parental grief also are really everywhere and nowhere in our literature and in our culture. And so if anyone, I know some people here do work in the fields of pediatric critical care, pediatric palliative care, end-of-life care, you will have been at that uncomfortable dinner party conversation. So you're having a conversation with some strangers at a dinner party, and they say, oh, so what do you do? And you say, oh, I work in pediatric oncology, or I work in pediatric critical care, or I work with bereaved parents with dying children. And automatically you get the reaction, right? They're uncomfortable. They never say, oh, isn't that interesting? Could you pass me the chips? That's not how you respond to that. And the response is generally, oh, I could never do that, or oh, you must be such a sensitive person, and oh, I have small children. Do you have children? You know, they're just kind of trying to test out the waters to figure out how are they supposed to feel about this and what it is that you do. And my point here is that really, while nobody wants to talk about it, everyone can form an opinion about what it is that we do. Now, interestingly, this slide is from a scoping review we did on family bereavement. So bereavement post-child loss in a family. And I just wanted to show you how there's been an explosion in the literature of studies. So between 1990 and 2010, there were 400 completed studies on this topic. That's a lot of studies for a field that was really, there was nothing in the 1970s. So we're thinking about it, we're writing about it, we're studying it. And I think the literature is really kind of coalescing around some major themes, that this is a horrible event for a family. This is a horrible event for a clinician. And there's some hard outcome data coming out recently that's really saying, yeah, it is horrible, and actually morbidity and mortality in the surviving parents is something that we really need to start thinking about, because we're seeing it, we're tracking it in our research. Now, as an anthropologist, when I want to try to make sense of this kind of everywhere, nowhere, what's going on, of course, what do? You go to Hallmark. And when you look at Hallmark, so I went to the online database. You can buy greeting cards for anything, okay? You know, their graduation, birthday, bar mitzvah, and of course there are sympathy cards. So in this database, there are 2,500 cards. 73 were for sympathy. So I drilled into that category. There were 4 for child loss, 2 of which were miscarriage. And let me tell you, about 10 years ago when I had done this sort of cursory search before the internet was really kind of this robust, I didn't find any. So it's interesting now that there are 4. But just to give you kind of an indication how this measures up, you can actually get 3 for pets. Wow. Okay, so nowhere? Is it nowhere? Is it everywhere? So in order to really kind of then figure out, well, how are people living, bereaved parents themselves living in this kind of ambivalent space? One location we looked at was in labor standards. So we did a study. This paper has been submitted. We did a study to look at kind of systematically how are labor standards and employment policies dealing with, responding to, supporting this population. We looked at labor codes, we looked at employment standard acts, we looked across Canada, so we looked provincially across Canada, also federally, but then we took a number of international locations like the States, like the European Union, and we looked across their federal codes as well. So what did we find? We did a descriptive analysis first, and that was just to see what in the heck is in these documents. And one of the things that we found was this very kind of managerial approach. It was clear that there's a moral obligation in these labor codes because labor codes enact protection for vulnerable populations. That's their job. They try to protect the vulnerable. So there was definitely a moral obligation in this literature, in these codes, but the way it was translated was you got approximately 3 days unpaid job-protected leave, and it was very much focused on ceremonial obligation. You had to either plan a funeral or you had to go to a funeral. There was nothing that extended into a sense of what is a grief process, what does it look like, and there was also very, very little. There was one location where we found anything that addressed how child loss might be different than other kinds of loss. So across the board, if your grandmother dies or your child dies, you get 3 days. Sometimes extended family got a slightly different allotment than nuclear family, but for the most part, that's what's in the codes. So we thought, well, okay, what's going on here? Can we dig into something else? Like, we were quite surprised by this. And so we looked at caregiver policy in Canada. It's called compassionate care policy, and this is becoming an international standard where it's policy that supports family members to stay at home with a dying loved one. And it will provide some income support and job protection to do this. So we thought, well, maybe those kind of codes anticipate bereavement. And what we found again, as soon as the loved one dies, you've got to get back to work. There's absolutely nothing that acknowledges an experiential sense of loss in these kind of codes. So for us, that was a bit surprising. What we then did was more of a critical discourse analysis of these documents. And by this, I really mean we kind of use the documents themselves as kind of barometers or indicators of the kind of the larger sociocultural beliefs and values around this topic. Right? So we kind of use them as a way in to think about how society thinks about this population. And what we found were there were kind of four main frames that really worked to exclude the bereaved from this policy. There was a managerial frame, which I just presented. There was also kind of a very normative frame. There was a neoliberal frame, and there was medicalization. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So in these documents, birth trumps death, always. So the beginning of life, maternity, paternity, family support is much more strongly valued than end of life. So kind of thinking about the way people cope with end of life just simply is just not present in these documents. Also important to think about is what kind of labor counts. So going back to the caregiving example, if you're caring for someone, there is both kind of moral and economic reward, and you're remunerated for your labor through employment policies. So you're actually getting some money to care. But when that loved one dies and you have to care for yourself, it is no longer valued as labor. It no longer counts as labor. And so we can think here about kind of labor and the public good, and what does society think is a public good here? Caring for the dying, yes, that's a good thing. Caring for yourself, not acknowledged. And then, of course, we have to talk about medicalization. The only socially legitimized response to grieving in a workplace is getting a doctor's note. That's the only thing we found across these policies. If you can translate your grief experience into an illness and get it medicalized with a doctor's note, then you can get sick leave. And that was the only thing we found. So then, of course, we go back to, so why is there a disconnect here? Why does the psychosocial literature, there's 400 completed studies telling us that this is a very profound experience for a family, for siblings, and yet the social code is telling us it's not that important. So in order to kind of drill into that a little bit more, we thought we'd scour the social science literature and try to get a sense of, can we build what I'm going to call a scaffold, a theoretical scaffold, to try to better understand bereaved parents and how we think about, socioculturally, how we think about bereaved parents. And so I'm just going to go through this scaffold in kind of broad strokes just to kind of give you a sense of what we have found. One of these kind of, as I said earlier, I'm calling it a cultural script or a narrative that we see across the literature. It's a sense of nature, narrative of nature, and narrative of progress. So we have to remember that it's kind of because there are medical technologies like vaccinations, our social policies like democracy, that we're currently in quite a robust society. We're quite healthy as a society, and we have these kind of trends to thank. But it's also really important to remember that, as scholars have pointed out, that infant mortality itself is a social construct that didn't come to public health until the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it didn't show up initially out of a moral concern for the health of babies. It showed up initially as a concern for the nation state and for imperialism. How do we make a robust society? Well, we have to make sure the kids stop dying. It has since then become a moral claim, but it didn't begin as a moral claim. We also see, kind of over, say, the 1900s, this development of the conception of childhood. We think of children as innocent, as vulnerable, as developing, they're emotionally immature, they're dependent. That's how we think of children, but that's not how we always think of children. It's a very modern way to think about what a child actually is. And so children gained childhoods over the 1900s and up to today by getting human rights. Children didn't have human rights. That was a pretty modern transition. Children lost their economic value in the sense that they've been protected from wage labor. We make kids go to school now. They're not allowed to work on the farm. They have to go to school. So we protect them from being kind of economically valuable. You can't sell your kid and get something back for it. But we've given them much more kind of deep social and emotional value. And this is not to say that people didn't always love their children. Of course they did. That's not the point. It's just, it seems like there is more currently at stake socially and emotionally. Children have an expressive value in a way that they used to have also an economic value. And so through this transition, we see kind of this also a moral transition. So we kind of have this descriptive fact in our society. Children no longer die. We have a pretty healthy society. Children don't often die. But we see this moral stance now. Children are no longer supposed to die. Children should not die. So related to this is, we found in the literature, this sense of future. So we see this tension between what are children? Are children something that children are being, or is it something that becomes? So I'll give you a few examples. We can think of a child as an entity upon which we bestow rights. We bestow responsibility, agency. They have inherently valid subjectivities, regardless of where they sit in this developmental kind of continuum from infancy through to adolescence. Or we can think of children as inherently in transition to becoming adults. Okay, so you see this tension in the literature. They are becoming, and therefore we need to educate them, we need to socialize them so that they become upstanding, good people when they arrive at adulthood. Okay, so these kind of tensions are happening in the literature. Also across these tensions is a sense of a normative social order. So children are not supposed to die before their parents because that disrupts the social order. Inheritance is going to be passed down to children. You invest in your child and then maybe they'll look after you when you're in your old age. So in order to figure out are we on the right track, of course, we have to go back to Hallmark. What does Hallmark say about this so far? Here's an example of one of their cards. In the card it says, parents never expect to outlive their children, and surely there is no loss that is sadder or harder to understand. Now, this wouldn't have made any sense in the 1800s. This is a very modern conception of what it is to be a parent and what we think it is to have a child. You're probably familiar with the IOM report, When Children Die. Some of you will be. This is a quotation that comes from the introduction, okay? And I just want to go through it to show you how there are narratives of nature, metaphors of nature. So when a child dies, it is always out of season. Although dying is a part of life, a child's death is unnatural, okay? We see metaphors of future, dreams, potential. Those are all signaling how children lead us to future. And then we see these rhetorical normative claims as well. It's always out of season. In a real sense, it's unnatural. So I think what we're seeing in the literature is a sense of this profound rupture in our narratives. It contravenes a sense of a natural social order, and I think this disruption is kind of at the crux of much of what our psychosocial literature is saying as well. And it really is undoing are deeply held ontological assumptions about what is a child and then what is a parent. So following from that, we have narratives of identity, personhood, and social codes. And here I'm drawing on the work of Malik Rida, who's done some really interesting work around miscarriage. And what she has found is, following a miscarriage, she saw in her empirical research what she called non-gestures and acts of non-recognition. And by this, she's referring to the lack of cards, the lack of party, the lack of visits from the grandparents that happened after a miscarriage, which would have been expected after a live birth of a healthy baby. And she's saying that it's through these non-gestures that you're actually also kind of conferring this non-status to the parent. So if a fetus is not considered to be a child, then the social response to the non-child confers the status of non-parent to the mother and the father. You can't be a parent if the child died. And in our own work, we've had parents tell us about these kinds of non-gestures. So the crossing the street to avoid having to talk to the bereaved mother, or the well-meaning in-law who threw out all of the deceased child's toys because she just thought, there's no kid anymore, so we don't really need the toys anymore. Or the hurt that bereaved parents feel when people don't acknowledge the birthday of the child. The other thing that we've seen is this kind of sense of social codes, and it constrains how you are as a bereaved parent. So you can't talk to your deceased child in public. You can do it in the privacy of your own home, and they do. They talk to their kids all the time. But you can't do it in public. And finally, we see these narratives of social exclusion. And this I'm drawing on some of the work of Tony Walter, who talks about these kind of implicit timelines that are imposed upon the bereaved. The idea of, like, shouldn't you be back at work yet? And, oh, she came back to work, everything must be okay. And this sense of the grief police, who are the well-meaning neighbors, perhaps, or the colleagues, or the social worker, the workers, who kind of will, through their talk and their gestures, kind of convey their sense of, okay, enough already, you should be done by now. We also heard from parents themselves talking about how they felt stigmatized, and they would just stay in their house, and they would increase their social exclusion and their isolation by just staying at home because they didn't like the way people looked at them. And there was this sense, and this is a very anthropological concept, of contagion, where they felt like people felt they were contagious, that they didn't want to come near them because it reminded them of their mortality, their own mortality, and they kind of didn't want to catch what that person had. And we also see it in our language. We don't have a word in English, and I've looked across many other languages as well, to convey bereaved parent in a way that doesn't require you to say bereaved parent. Because the social convention is, if you don't have a child, you can't be a parent. So we can't just call them parents, we have to call them bereaved parents. And so we kind of have this social convention of what it means to be a parent. And so if you don't have a child, your child is no longer alive, what do we call them? So if you are a child without parents, you could be an orphan, or if you're a spouse, you could be a widow or a widower, which is kind of conveying a certain social role for you. But if you're a bereaved parent, you're a bereaved parent. We don't have a word to say it any other way. So we wanted to test this scaffold, and we wanted to test it in a location where we would find bereaved parents, and to see, what did we get right and what needs to be tweaked. And so one location is the internet. And so we went and we scoured internet memorials put up by bereaved parents to think about how our scaffold, our theoretical frame, works or needs more work. So in this paper you can find more about the methodology. I'm not going to really go through the methodology. Suffice it to say, we looked at hundreds and hundreds of sites. I just want to talk about how this research reinforces or contests what I've been talking about. So for those of you who don't know what a virtual memorial is, it looks like this. As I said, this is public. These are public domain sites as well. Anyone can go. All of the data I'm talking about from here on is all in the public domain. So they're kind of just classic interactive sites. You can build them. They have templates. You can kind of engage with the template, but upload your own creative stuff if you want to. A lot of them have, again, reference to pets. This one, it's really important, says at the bottom, it's a group for the bereaved, by the bereaved. And this is kind of part of this resisting the pathologizing, resisting the medicalizing, and saying, we're going to do it for ourselves. And so that's quite important on a lot of these sites. Here's another example of one at the top. I don't know if you can see that. It says your Center for Online Healing. So they're making therapeutic claims. It's completely unregulated, so you can say whatever you want. So here they're making therapeutic claims. I don't know if you can see that or not, but in this box it says there are 95,000 memorials on this site with 4.5 million virtual candles that have been lit. Like, this is a huge industry. And it's a whole other world that when I present some of this stuff to clinicians, they had no idea that this was happening. And yet it's right there, it's happening. And of course, one of the catches is it's capitalism rearing its head and really kind of running amok with what grief workers have kind of created this idea of the continuing bonds. You're supposed to maintain these relationships, and it's going to be healthy if you maintain these relationships with the deceased. Well, you can pay for it. And remember, this is a very vulnerable population. Once you create one of these things and you start paying, how are you ever going to stop paying? You create a site for your child, your loved one, and you stop paying and it's gone. It's no longer your property. So that's a whole other thing we could have a conversation about. So how does this reproduce or rewrite the cultural scripts I was talking about? So what about death? How does death show up on these sites? Well, first of all, the sites that we looked at, and as I said, there are hundreds, they are classically, prototypically about children. So the language is about angels, heroes, the perfect child. The clip art is all rosy and happy, and there are hearts and there are teddy bears. The client-generated photos and videos are marking this development of time, so we go from the ultrasound to the birth, to the first birthday, to the graduation from preschool, what have you, right? So it marks time across these milestones. Importantly, on these sites, these kids are alive. They're very alive. They are happy. They're not ill. They are not in hospital. They are not in graveyards. They are alive. There's pictures sitting on Grandpa's lap. They're playing with the dog. They're going to brownies. Let's talk about social categories. So this is a post from a mother who is bereaved herself, and she's happened onto a site. And these sites are all interactive, so you can type in and start conversations or respond to conversations. And so she's writing in, and I've taken out the names. This is all public domain, but it felt voyeuristic to put names in, so we took out the names. That's another conversation we could have. That was just my own heebie-jeebies. So she's writing in, and so it's important to see the language she's using. Thank you for sharing your angel with me. I know we don't physically know each other, but I feel that bereaved parents are connected forever. I admire you for being so strong, such a wonderful inspiration to others, and for being such a great mummy to your angel. God bless you and your family. She calls herself an angel mummy. This is very, very common terminology across these sites. And for us, grammatically, this is really interesting because it's embedding the deceased child in her new title, Angel Mummy, has the deceased child right in the title. So instead of bereaved parent A, it's Angel Mummy A. Another social category here is what's called an angelversary. And an angelversary is marking the day of the death, or it could be marking the birthday. So it's kind of used in both contexts. And there are sites where the sites actually enable the connecting of angel friends or creating forever friends amongst the deceased. So it's kind of the power of the site to almost create these virtual neighborhoods of angels. So deceased children who are called angels. So these neighborhoods online that get created through these sites. So how about narratives of future? So in this first quote, what we see is the deceased child projected into the future. So I know that death is very sad, but knowing that you will be there waiting for me gives me every reason to not be scared of death. So it's a sense that the mother knows when she dies, the child will be there in heaven waiting for her. So the child will still be there in the future. These next two quotes really show parents, and this is the concept of parenting that I talked about before. So angel mummies, a lot of this is mothers, giving their kids advice. Hello, Pickle, just lighting a quick candle to tell you to wrap up. It's rather nippy outside. All my love now and forever. The second one, happy heavenly birthday. I wish you were here to be 19. I miss you and love you with all my heart. Have fun, okay, sweetie? So I think these two quotes really show the parents are still parenting. Who wouldn't want their kid to have a jacket if it was cold? It doesn't matter if it's heaven or on earth, they're cold. Put on a jacket. There are a lot of quotes on these sites that are really about the banal. What's going on today? We're building an extension on the garage. Auntie's in the hospital. Just wanted you to know I bought a new coat. These last three are by strangers who have happened onto the sites, and they're writing either to the parents or they're writing directly to the deceased children. So the first one, I'll keep you in my prayers and please be a friend to my child. I worry about him being alone. So she's imploring, this is a stranger, imploring the deceased child in heaven to find her child in heaven and be friends. The next one, I hope you're skateboarding with my child. And then the final one, writing to a parent saying, my child loved to play Uno too. One of his little friends is in heaven, so maybe they could get together and have a game. And finally, looking at social exclusion and how these sites maybe can mitigate some of that. So in this first quote, it's really important to say that these quotes, the control is in the parents' hands. So the parents can edit out the grief police. There could be people coming in to police what is going on following Tony Walter, but the parents are in control and they can take down things that they don't like. So in this, we see a complete stranger bonding over the loss. And at the end of the quote, you'll see she says, I look forward to learning more about your child and I'm going to stop by again. It's like the sense of a neighborhood. You just pop by, see how someone's doing, and then you can leave. This one, you see reassurance coming. Your daughter's safe with mine, playing with the other angels. Here we see cyber hugs. There's reassurance. There's advice. And then finally, this sense that if you ever need to talk, let me know. I'm going to be there for you. These are complete strangers. They've never met. But I will be there for you. In closing, this was a 3-year project. It has morphed into a lifetime program of research. I think we barely scratched the surface, hence the iceberg. I think we need a lot more. I think this is really kind of uncovering how much we don't know and a lot of our social assumptions about this population. I think in terms of really trying to take these empirical findings and think through healthy public policy and citizen engagement, we're not there yet. And I think groups like this are exactly what's needed to try to push that agenda forward. So Acknowledgements to my incredible team and my funders, and that's it.
So, Mary Ellen, I'd be happy to help facilitate the discussion,
Please.
or you can do it on your own, your choice.
We'll see. We'll
Open
see
it
how
up
we go.
for questions and comments. Dan?
You mentioned that it was mostly mothers on the websites. Have you done any work on any sort of gender differences in the expression online in these sites?
Yeah, it is mostly mothers who are writing, and it's hard to say how much the fathers are in the background, reading silently. We don't know, and that's one of the things that we actually want to pick up empirically is then to actually go to the parents and then engage them in that kind of conversation, because that part of the project was simply just looking at the internet to think about it, but we don't actually have that kind of data yet to know what's going on in terms of gender.
It's just there's a lot of new data from other social networking sites that suggest that women are far more likely to make those kind of relationships with complete strangers, whether it's on Pinterest or on Facebook or things like that. So.
I think that's very true. And there's, interestingly, more and more research coming out on fathers. Different ways, like there's one of my students just recently published a paper just looking at how, classically in qualitative research we use interviews and how they might not be the best mode of research with fathers or with men in general. So I think we're just kind of starting to unpack that. It's a good reminder, thank you.
So have you, I think the answer is probably no, but have you had an opportunity to talk to folks yet to find out, their motivations for using these sites and what these sites do for them in their grief process and how continuing that conversation and setting up play dates and all of that, what role that's serving?
Well, it's interesting. I presented some of this in a forum where there were bereaved parents, and one of the women was actually kind of giggling, and she's like, as if we didn't do that before the internet. She's like, as if the internet just created something, and it enables something at a more kind of maybe international or national level, but they were sitting around having coffee, setting up play dates for their kids before the internet. That was her response to that. So I think, that's something that we really want to do to go forward and to kind of engage that more directly, and also look at, there's a lot of stuff going on Facebook as well, and someone suggested that it could be siblings are using Facebook in ways that parents are using these kind of sites because they can pay, whereas siblings are actually using Facebook because it's free. So that's something that we haven't explored.
Thank you very much for this great talk. It was really, really interesting. So I have a more of a historical question. So you mentioned that for miscarriages, there is this problem of non-gestures and non-recognition. Has it ever been different?
Has it ever been different? You mean over time,
Right,
historically?
over time, yeah.
That's a really great question. Maybe someone here knows the historical literature better. I don't know.
Because at
Yeah.
least in the past, I'm from France.
Okay.
Like if you look at the 16th century literature,
Mm-hmm.
great writers can't even give the number of children that they've lost. So
Okay, so
3 or 4.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. And I was thinking more specifically miscarriage, but that's a modern concept too,
Right. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So stillbirth, miscarriage. And it used to be, you see in classic, say 16th, 17th century photographs of families where the deceased shows up kind of as a halo, right? So they're actually in the picture of the family, but they're represented as halos, and so not beings in the same way. So there is some interesting literature on that.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
My second question was about the practice of baby showers in the U.S. So I've never seen this in any other country that you would have baby showers before the birth of a baby. And this shows, I think, this great trust in
That's fascinating.
the lack of infant mortality. So
Yeah,
the fact
that's a
that
good
it's
point.
very low.
Yeah.
Whereas in other countries, this is really this would be extremely inappropriate.
So that's, well, yeah, and you see, like in the anthropological literature, scenarios in which you don't actually name the baby for many days or weeks after they're born, just to make sure they're actually going to decide to stay on the earth or not, depending on the cultural tradition you're coming from. It's kind of, it's up to that infant to decide, do they want to stay or do they want to go back? And so you don't actually acknowledge them as a human that's going to stay on earth for a certain number of days. Then they reach that threshold, you give them a name, and then they become part of this family as opposed to another worldly family. So the baby shower, that's a really interesting point. And I know one of the bereaved parents we spoke to, that was the hardest thing for her was then having this room full of stuff. And what do you do with it?
It would
That
be
is
really
true,
interesting
it's
to see when it started in the US.
I would love to look at that.
But I
How do you know?
think there are certain cultural ethnic subgroups, even in the US, who
Mhm.
believe
Oh,
in
yeah,
those
sure.
things. It's superstitious.
No, of course, like Russians would never do that.
That's really interesting.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the presence of religion and any of the things you came across. I couldn't help but notice like words like angel
Yeah.
and God bless in some of the text.
Yeah, I think it's definitely some sort of religious overtone. What it exactly means, I can't tell you. Like how much of it is that angel is actually this Christian imagery and it's located in this place that we're calling heaven, and how much of it is that as an angel it's this being that can't feel pain. I don't know that, and I think that's something that I know. I have a colleague in Texas who's trying to think about that language and to figure out what angel actually means. But then religion more broadly, I can't really speak to that specifically except from what you've seen, because we haven't drilled into that concept.
Anita?
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is really interesting. I was thinking about a presentation that was at, talking about end of life in acute care settings and how our technology makes the grieving and the coping so much more complicated. And it might have been an anthropology student, I think it was an anthropologist, we were arguing that there could be obligations of the clinicians involved to help people, especially who might not be practicing a religion of origin or becoming more secular or blending different faith traditions where it's unclear to them what the rituals are, that we have some obligation to help them establish new rituals to cope. And the anthropologist's viewpoint was, oh, no, you never do that. That culture evolves and that you don't have to intervene in that process. It will naturally evolve. So this looks like maybe a natural evolution of people needing more help in coping with loss, in this case of children. Do you have an opinion about our obligation maybe as professionals in helping with that process?
It's so, like, especially the internet stuff, when I present it to clinicians, I often get, I refer to it as my heebie-jeebies paper, because they are uncomfortable not intervening on one level, because I have a number of colleagues who find like there's just something pathological about this. It's not okay. Because what else is happening in the home? Are they neglecting their other children while they're sitting on the internet and they're building these sites? And they want, because as clinicians, of course, we want to do something. Like, quick, let's do something. So, as an anthropologist, I'm in the luxury seat of saying, I don't know, you guys decide. I'm just telling you what I found. But it's also really important to then work in interdisciplinary context and have the people who intervene with the people who don't intervene to think through some of these things. But also as an anthropologist, I don't like the idea of anything being natural, because nothing is natural. Everything is a social construct of something, right? So it may seem on some level kind of a natural evolution, but it's not natural at all. It's kind of coming from social processes and social forces that are enabling or requiring this kind of development at a certain time and a certain place. But the actual intervention component of it, I'm not qualified to answer that. But it would be interesting if some people here feel like it's clear the direction we go towards intervention. Someone at the back.
I'm struggling with the counterfactual about your social policy. I picked up a tone of disapproval of the funeral's over, get back to work. But how about the funeral's over, now stay home for 2 weeks because you're special? Is that where you want us to go and why? And why is that therapeutic to stay home for whatever? What were you thinking?
It's more a scenario of it's going to be individual and that it can't be imposed by an inflexible policy. So there are going to be some scenarios, especially, and this is a gendered thing, where men are going to be more likely to want to get back to work, and they're going to deal with it in their own way by riding their bike in the evening. Whereas women don't want to be back in the workplace, and these are total stereotypes, and they want to be at home crying, and they don't want anyone to bother them. And so that's just an extreme stereotype, but that comes out in the literature for sure. Then there's the issue of, do you have other kids at home? Or are you thinking about having other kids? So that comes as well. The simply not having any safety net is a huge problem, I think. So 3 days, we all know how quickly 3 days goes. And if anyone's been through a loss, we know that it's not going to hit you probably for 7, 14, 28 days from there. That's when it's going to hit you, when all the casseroles stop coming to the house and you are alone. That's when it's going to hit you. And that's when you're going to want to go to your boss and say, I need some time. These policies, a lot of them are saying the moment of the death, the day after the death, the bereavement leave starts. Not all of them, but a lot of them stipulate it has to, exactly when it happens. It's not like you can take it over the next year. It's you got to take it now, because it's really about the funeral. It's about traveling across the state, getting to the funeral, getting back home. And that's really how it's cast.
But there's also a physical component to grief, where people have trouble sleeping, people have trouble eating. So the actual functioning, I think, at work or getting back to your life immediately is very, very difficult. And that contributes, I think, to the medicalization. The numbers of people that I know who are on antidepressants because of a loss. I think it's partly to treat this sort of physical non-functioning.
We've looked at it, tried to look at it through the lens of disability policy, and then come at it from another lens of chronic illness policy, and trying to think about where does grief fit? It's not a disability in that you can't then just build a ramp and all of a sudden everything's okay. And it's more like chronic illness, where some days are great, some days are horrible. I can work in the morning, I can't work in the evening, but our neoliberal policies don't allow those kind of bodies in workplaces. You have to have an efficient body that can be awake from 9 to 5. That's what workplaces need. So if you need to have a siesta from 1 to 3 and you just need some downtime, then it's not going to work in those kind of worlds.
You had your hand up for a while.
Excuse me. Have you run in your studies any comparison with in bereavement, a child dying, of the sadness that sometimes occurs after an abortion?
Yes, and that's where this label disenfranchised grief is being used. So it's the unspoken grief that you're not allowed to talk about it because there's kind of the moral culpability. You caused it, perhaps. You're not allowed to talk about it. You don't want to talk about it. You don't want to admit it happened. And there was one woman in our study who was there after an abortion, and she considered herself a bereaved parent. And this is 10 years later, and she bawled through the interview. She cried through the entire interview. So that's definitely a very interesting population to look at.
It seems like, by definition, angel babies or angel children would be perfect children.
Yes.
And a place to project, your hopes.
Yeah.
So that if you had no other children or had children who weren't perfect, that's they're not going to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like that's what, spiritually or religiously, a place to place your hope.
Well, and on the sites, you don't see any sibling rivalries. You don't see any, oh, remember that time you told me to da-da-da. You don't see any. It's all, and my child was perfect.
Idealized.
Very, very idealized. And we all do that with our kids. We always forget all of the stress and the back talk. It's like, of course our kids are perfect.
Yeah, I was just curious if you've looked at the existing of social network profiles that exist after the person has died. And now this is becoming more and more common as younger and younger children start having Facebooks and things like that. But I always found that to be a very particularly weird space, because I mean, I remember the first time it happened was I was in high school when Facebook just started, and one of our classmates died of cancer. And for the first couple weeks, they left the Facebook up just almost as a practical thing. You know, if you want to post something about funeral specifications, or how to take food to the family. But after about a couple months, it was still up there, and it became this almost memorial. People would post pictures, but then I remember one day that the parents were just like, "We can't do this anymore. This is become a thing of its own." So I'm not sure if you've seen that, or have any thoughts about that whole kind of concept, kind of leaving up someone's profile as like a memorial or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing we see with these sites is the whole, if you were to take your child's site down, then you're also extracting the child from all these new social relationships.
Right.
So this virtual neighborhood that got created, you're then taking your child out of that neighborhood. And someone in one of the presentations I gave referred to it as you'd be unplugging your child again. It's like, whoa.
Well, what better way to have your child be remembered? People can say their name and think of them.
And see them and think of them, and especially if it's free, right? If it's Facebook, it's free, and that you have control over what goes on, so you can make sure that there's not stuff out there that you don't. It's when it costs that it gets a bit more problematic, but still.
With Facebook, you then get all the adverts down the side of it. With a lot of those sites, advertising is not necessarily as prominent on it,
because you're paying.
You're paying
That's
for
right.
it, as you would pay for a gravestone or a grave.
Exactly, and which costs way more than these things, right? But they're doing both. Of course, they're doing both. But still, it's true. Maybe it's not a lot of money.
I just wanted to say we've had a lot of trouble with neonatal loss, that people don't want to come back into the hospital for a support group situation, and therefore the internet is a really great way to function and to find support all around. It's interesting.
That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and partly that's the whole for the bereaved by the bereaved. It's in a safer somehow place, and plus they don't have the memories of going back into the institution. Yeah, but at the same time, some of the work I did earlier, parents found it really helpful to come back to the memorial service because it was the first time, it kind of forced them back into the institution. And as painful as it was, one mother talked about how after that, coming back in, she could then drive by the turnoff on the highway and not think about it anymore. Whereas prior to that, every single time she drove by that turnoff, she had that reaction. So I guess it kind of goes both ways. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more. Oh, I'm sorry, Farrell. No. Time for two more.
It's focused on apparently younger children. Have you had any insights into the parental loss of adult children?
Absolutely, and that was part of our original study, was to look at that across and try to do some comparison. And the age doesn't matter. In so many ways, the age does not matter. That once a parent, always a parent. And one of the women in our study is 86, and her son died at age 50. And she engaged it as her baby. He was her baby, and the second, or right after he died, she put on black. She was Italian, and she wore black, and she's never listened to the radio since, and she won't go to dances and the whole bit. So it didn't matter that the child was 50. In her eyes, it was her baby.
Mark.
I wondered if you looked at any link to disease blogs. So rallying around a child with cancer, the army of supporters that and there the images are the child in the hospital or sick or so on, where these images are sterilized of all the disease part.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We haven't done that, but that would be really interesting. No, you're absolutely right, because there's no disease on these sites. It's just not there. So that'd be a really interesting thing to do. Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Mary Ellen.